All right, folks. Fred made the observation that since we've got this blank spot in the schedule, to probably go ahead and see if we can finish up on the action items list that was this morning. And Dick threatened to walk out, so I can't say that I blame him. But in any case, there are a few more comments and questions that were either directly stated or extracted out of some of your comments. So it's probably a good idea at this point to get those noted and archived, if you will, for the next version of the feedback that comes from us. So in any case, the first one, we should hear about status and plans for the patch process, e.g. deployment. This and future sessions, I expected that as of this morning, we would have probably had a little bit more of that, considering Steve's influence on that procedure and the architecting of the patch deployment process. That can, however, be something that is queued up for a future session where we do nothing but spend time on how we're going to mitigate the issues that we have with regards to patch management at this point. So that's why it's slated as a this or / future session. I don't know if Steve, when we talk about what his new role is, if there's any sort of things that he wants to say. We're talking about patch management stuff.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so
well, maybe this is a good time to talk about your role as well. So
that's good because I have 7 minutes, so that bounds the abuse that I can take. So the press coverage. And there are 2 pieces of press coverage. One of them depending on what you saw. One is that I have this new cool job running a strategy team for the security business unit to try to put more focus on the stuff we've been talking about today. Like how do we write secure code better and more coherently. And the other major focus is actually trying to put together programs to get tools and information out to customers who are not on our latest and greatest software. One of the things that we know Windows Server 2003 is a lot better than its predecessors, and there are 83 copies of it out. Actually, there are a lot more copies of it out than that, but they're certainly not 5 or 10% of our installed base out yet. So what do we do for the other 90 or 95 or 98 or whatever it is % of the installed Microsoft base? And the answer, really has to be tools to lock systems down, tools to configure them securely, tools to get the patches on them quickly, information about doing that. So the other focus of my team, that's a second focus of my team, is what do we do for existing customers, and then the third focus is really kind of other duties as assigned and sort of higher level crises. That's what I'm doing. There are, some of the press more or less got that right. Other press picked up a quote from an analyst who didn't know what I was doing or anything about it, and said that I had been fired as a scapegoat for Microsoft's failure to improve its security.
And all those children that he fathered.
Is that the New York Times?
Actually, that's information security. It's Robert Enderle as quoted in information security. And attractive as that solution, as that option sounds, the reality is that I'm stuck here. One of the pieces is patch management. Scott has actually been heavily involved with putting together and driving our patch management task force for the company. We're trying to improve things in a major way in 4 dimensions. One of them is information about patches, better bullet content, better knowledge base content, better alerting, other things to help people know when the patches are released and whether they need them or not. Second is the patch packaging itself, common practices, common processes, so that you can always get a silent install, you can always get it uninstalled. You can always tell whether a patch is on the system or not, and reducing the number of installers. At this point, we have 8 installers that different groups use to deploy patches, and the plan is that by sometime next year, we'll be down to 2, one for the operating system components and one for everything else. Yes, correct.
I understood there was a series of meetings of some kind of a patch management task force. Is there a white paper or?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that something that
It's publicly available.
Yeah, it's on the web.
I can get a copy of it to make sure it's available.
send me the URL or
Sure.
something like
Yeah.
that?
Or even put it on the board website.
I can do that as well.
Very good.
And so patch information, match with dollars, patch quality. You know, what do we do about testing and reviewing testing patches, so that when we put them out, they fix the problem they're intended to fix, which is something that we've done relatively well at, and don't have any unfortunate side effects, which is something, frankly, that we've done less well at. And that's really a matter of discipline and process. And the other aspect is that there are teams who just don't do very many patches, and so we need to provide some backstop for them rather than letting them learn the process when they do have to do it at customers' expense. And then the fourth component is tools to support patch management, and that's sort of upgrades or next generations for what we call Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, Software Update Service, Windows Update, SMS. The basic idea there is to go to a consolidated tool set that would be able to deploy. Today you go to Windows Update, you get this auto-updating experience, scans your system, figures out what you need, and rolls it out. If it's a Windows component, the vision, probably within less than a year, is to basically, for any product, go to an update site, have it scan your system, say, well, you've got Office, you've got SQL, you've got Exchange, you need this, and this patching, and it rolls them all out to you. So that's the patch management vision, as well as the snapshot of what my result is.
If there's desire for more information about this, you can let me know, and we can get it in the queue of things to cover in depth at one of the future meetings. So I'll leave it up to you folks to figure out how deep you want to go on that issue, but we can make it happen if necessary. Next bullet down, to what extent do you understand the market for security? I looked at this question and I sort of scratched my head over it, and I think we all did a little bit. Is this question asking our number of seats that we can possibly sell to, or because I don't know who.
This is a placeholder for there to be a discussion about business strategy that's pegged on security as a selling point.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You weren't expected to answer this, but come up with a bunch of people.
Well, that's good, because I was sitting there going, well, there are about 900 different answers to this one, and if I stick my stake in the sand, I'm bound to be wrong. So good. I'm glad I sort of left that open.
My sense is that we also had the feeling that if you're going to keep doing this for 10 years, at some point down the line, you're going to want to make sure that it's actually making money for you or saving money for you.
Right.
So
Right.
Is this a sustainable enterprise?
Right.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
all right, that makes sense. Need to have a peer-to-peer discussion about punching holes in firewalls. That's something that I can get queued up for one of the future sessions. Again, the balance of time versus content is what's driving most of the stuff here. Issues surrounding the role of MSR in the corp. Well, we had sort of a quasi-discussion about that a few minutes ago. As I said, there are discussions going on both between Microsoft Research and SBU and Scott's group and a variety of other things. We're looking. I know Scott has committed to asking Rick and Dan what their philosophy is on this kind of a question. So we're more than happy to report back once we actually have something definitive to say on the matter. But again, it may manifest itself in the discussion tomorrow, but we sort of semi-covered that today.
There's actually a separate question the board should think about, and that is what participation would the board like to see of MSR at our meetings? So, for instance, the TAB meetings, all of MSR is actually invited to listen to the open sessions. Now, I'm not saying that that should be the case here, but for instance, I think Amitabh and probably Dan would have benefited from the discussion that we just had about software architecture and security and so on, and they were not here to hear that. So yes, we can convey that through David to them, but somehow there was a we missed something in the last couple of hours. So we should probably think of that offline.
You're going to have a comment, Fred?
Yeah, but I can have it in a closed meeting.
Okay. Need to hear about CLR and language-based security vision. Again, future session. That's something that would be relatively painless to set up. Web services. I've actually got Chris Kaler and the web services folks primed to talk. It was actually on the agenda initially for the first meeting, but when I was giving you the fire hose treatment last time, we just ran out of slots to stick it in there. So that's probably something that I will make sure is addressed in the next meeting. What about fusion and data mining? Again, a future session. I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but that's unfortunately what I've got to do in this case. Spam solutions. Now, we've had some discussions with regards to spam solutions, and there's two different vectors that we have to look at here. Number one, there's the policy procedure. As you know, Microsoft has initiated quite a few legal actions against spammers and things of that nature. I don't know if that is of interest to you or not. Pardon me?
Go get them.
Go get them. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
when it comes to that topic, I mean,
I think that is of interest.
you could talk for hours on that topic. So there's that portion, and then there are other technical things that are going on, whether it's in MSN or it's something that Cynthia's doing down in Silicon Valley or something of that nature. So when I talked to Ira and Steve and Scott about this, they said, look, let's make that into its own discussion where we can really get into it. If we had, maybe an hour to do it, it wouldn't do either of the avenues justice. So it is something that we will deal with.
I think we were also interested in using it as a case study to see how the policy and the technical
Work together.
Research,
Exactly.
Operational.
It might be interesting in that regard, but it wouldn't be interesting to talk about it for input purposes because it's so far along. It's been so active for 9 months now that I think it would just be inappropriate to tell you about it as if we're soliciting input when it's pretty well baked. But if you wanted to do it as a case study, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I think that was part of the interest.
I'm happy to do so. So we can figure something out there, but we just want to make sure that we have adequate time to dedicate to it so it makes sense to everyone. What tools work is done beyond program analysis and testing? Well, that's, again, sort of an adjunct to the conversation that we had this afternoon. I would probably, in this case, wind up deferring to Amitabh or John or something like that to sit there and say, what are we doing, and have them come in and share their thoughts about that kind of stuff. I don't know. Is there anything that you're willing to disclose or can disclose or anything of that nature now?
There's obviously some effort being done to get a tool set around some notion of identifying changes in attack vectors, working some with the threat modeling people to, as well as the privacy analysis people, to both make sure that these are interacting with the rest of our tools, and also to help them explore synergies between the two. Those are, I'd say, and there's some work getting done in the systems and networking group on detecting configuration changes and rolling back configuration changes of systems, the Strider work.
Is that eMIN's? Yeah, that's eMIN's work. Right.
And those are the things that I'm aware of that are going on in this space. It's a good topic to go into more detail.
Yeah, and I can cue eMIN up for the next meeting or a suitable time if that's of interest.
Work.
Pardon me?
Is eMIN's work security related?
Reliability. I mean, you could look at it as a reliability issue. And that's one of the other things, too, that we've recognized is up to this point, we've had some fairly serious discussions about security and privacy, but we've been paying scant attention to the reliability vector here. And I know that SOMA is interested in getting involved with this group and making sure that the reliability efforts that are going forward are adequately vetted in this group as well. So that will probably wind up being the priority for this next meeting, is reliability-based solutions. So at least that's what we've been talking about up to this point. So
also related to that, Tom Ball just started a new group in testing, verification, and measurement, separate from Jim Laris's group on software productivity within PPRC. So maybe by next time he'll have something to say.
Let me hear something about formal tools you guys are beginning to use.
what was that?
Jim Laris started talking about Slick and Slam and some formal verification-based tools. Will we get about
Right.
that?
I guess it's the question of where do you draw the line between program analysis and formal verification tools. There certainly is a lot of work in Jim's group and Yuri's group as well, the ASML group, looking. So there's a lot of collaboration trying to see how we can do some kind of verification of at least partial correctness. What circumstances we can do that by. Technologies that I, being a static analysis person, would say, well, that's just static analysis. So they certainly cross over that.
We can get that queued up or have some adjunct material put out on the website or something like that if there's interest in looking at that kind of stuff as well. Let me cue back to the original list. Okay, we've... Okay, discussion of the latest critical bug fixes, processes, etc. That discussion probably should be best led by the man who's leaving the room right now. But
What did I just do?
there was a suggestion, a request to talk about, in this latest round of critical fixes, some of the board members had said, would the procedures that are in place now basically serve as insurance that things like this are not going to happen again.
Wait, that wasn't the question.
No.
It was, why did these happen?
And we had a couple.
That they were the victims of, they were the products of the security push.
Oh, I see. Yeah, right.
What?
What broke? It's not what the bug is. It's a question about the process.
Yeah, and that's a fair question. Can I take it tomorrow sometime?
Yeah.
Okay. I just have a.
Deserves a real careful treatment.
Okay. Sure. I mean,
I was getting it, Fred.
Or you can talk tonight while we eat.
Now there's an attractive offer. Question. No, I'd rather do it tomorrow. I'm afraid you'd lose your appetite. So, I'll cover it tomorrow.
All right, great. MSR management changes. There hasn't been a whole lot other than the fact that the MSR sponsorship of this group coming together, if you will, is moving on to a different group in Microsoft. But we're being basically subsumed by Kevin Schofield, who is a direct report to Rick Rashid, and who also handles the technology transfer portion of Microsoft Research into the product group. So I seem to recall a question where people were wanting to know more about the technology transfer process from MSR into the product group. So now I'm part of the group that actually focuses on that. So I can have Kevin come in at some point and do a chapter and verse on how technology gets from point A to point B inside the company. So. Let me see what else we got here. Pelican acquisition. Well, the Pelican acquisition, the fellow that was actually queued up to do that got called away at the last minute, so I guess we'll have to table that. That looks like it's about it. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Is there anything that I didn't cover that you think I missed or that I should have covered?
What was the thing on that Longhorn? What was the next slide?
Well, I thought we covered that one.
I know, I forgot. Oh, future session.
Yeah. Yeah, so obviously with regards to the last Longhorn session, it wasn't really what people were looking for. So there are a number of different things that, with regards to Longhorn, where we'll have the correct people in the room to make the correct statements about what's going on. And that's probably going to wind up being part of the discussion next time around.
Maybe since we have 5 minutes, let me make an observation. So tomorrow we'll have a Palladium talk. And I haven't sat through very many of them, but I've sat through 2 where there are non-insider audiences, and I'll consider us a non-insider audience. And based on what I've seen happen in the past, we have a big slot for this, and I suggest that if what happens is people jump on it very early, then there's a whole bunch of good stuff that we won't get a chance to discuss. So I would like to propose for your consideration that we have a rule like the only questions are questions of clarification with no agenda for the first half hour or 45 minutes of the talk, so that we get a good idea of what the picture is, and then we spend time on discussion. In particular, there are going to be 2 kinds, I predict, of questions. There's this whole issue, there are technical questions, what should be built, and what are the pros and cons of building it one way or another. And there's a business question, like what problem is this thing trying to solve? And it would be useful if we keep those 2 things disentangled. We should cover both of them, but we should try to talk about one and then talk about the other. And I don't think you could do a good job of talking about either one until we've let the people who are building it have a shot to tell us what they think it is, and also how they think they understand it. When we ask questions, we sometimes lead the speaker into thinking about things on our terms. And we can do that by the end of the session, but why not learn as much as we can before we've done that? So if you guys are on board for that, besides you'll be asleep at the beginning of the session anyway, maybe we could just let them have, say, 45 minutes to do a presentation, and then open it up for open questions. So, write notes and keep questions. Does anybody want to push back on that? Well, if you do want to push back on it, catch me privately before dinner or something, but I would like policy.
Any other questions, comments?
Do that tomorrow. In the first half hour, 45 minutes, you should say, I have a clarifying question, and then you...
Yeah.
And everybody else will see if it actually sounds like a clarifying question and correct you if it's not.
Okay. Well, we're waiting right now for Jeff Friedberg to show up, so he should be here within the next minute.
About when the next meeting would be?
Well, maybe now's a good time as any. The first meeting that we had was in February. Now, I don't know whether that was good or bad for people, but that is one of the questions at one point that over the next half day that I was going to toss out there to get people's opinions on. Does anyone have any particular? February is good?
It would be particularly nice if it were back-to-back with Tech Fest. So then we can go, if we were allowed to go see Tech Fest, then we could go see that.
What's Tech Fest?
That's a great idea.
There's MSR Tech Fest.
Yeah,
and basically what that is it's a showcase of MSR technologies for the entire company. So I can definitely look into that.
It's sort of
under NDA?
Yes.
I was under an NDA, and there was...
Yeah, it's blue badge only. I've already been rejected for it. I've made a formal request.
Well, I think they rejected you for...
Well, yeah. I started showering again.
Ask about your neck.
Lab members were allowed.
Were they?
Yes.
Well, then if that's the case, we've got the president late.
They were probably just escorted.
That's fine. Yeah, I really...
I didn't
I actually think it would be fantastic.
Escorted.
Yeah, I don't think you can escort Raj anywhere. Yeah, I think it would be fantastic. So I'm more than happy to broach that subject, and ultimately I think Kevin Schofield is the person that has the say-so on that thing, and he's my boss now. So
You know, even better than hearing from the MSR people who are developing tools would be to walk around TechFest and see some stuff.
well, that's exactly what right. Do the TechFest thing, get to walk the conference center, see all the different technologies as they're being
that could be
used.
part of the meeting.
Is that a one-day thing?
It's 2 days.
It's multiple days, so they can accommodate the entire company going in and out. But
Does anybody know when TechFest is?
I don't know when it is, but I can probably find out before the end of. I think I can find out before the end of the day. Noel, can you talk to someone and see if you can find that out? Great. If we can get that date before the end of the day, then we'll come back and broach the subject again. But I think it'd be fantastic for you guys to come.
Another random thought. I'd love to look at real, honest-to-God threat model for some product.
Yeah, real, honest-to-God threat.
So
Yeah, I agree with that.
During a break, I asked, I think, John, and he said it was like 150 pages for an honest-to-God threat model. So
I can find, I can get one of those threat models that we've done and put it out on the website.
That would be great.
And the tool, during the session yesterday at the faculty summit, I can probably get access to the tool as well. I don't think there's any, if you want to. So,
just it helps me to ground some of that discussion if I see very concrete.
I'm happy to do so.
Tool shouldn't be a problem because they've already given it to me, so they obviously have no standards.
Okay. All right. Yeah, but I'll see what I can do. Any other requests for either information, timing, what have you? Okay, I'll see what I can do with regards to finding out the date for TechFest, and if we can make that happen, maybe we can designate one of those days and then have the meeting follow up directly thereafter. So, or perhaps previous to the TechFest. So, what's that?
I just imagine it's on a website somewhere.
Possibly. I mean, this far in advance, it may or may not be. I know they have to get the conference center booked, but I've got no idea where that information would be housed. But I'll be sure to get it. So, all right. Well, why don't we take 5 and wait for Steve to show up, or Jeff to show up.
But anything that's graphical is no.
Otherwise, all I get is static.
Noise.
Well, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started here. In response to the request from the board to be involved at an earlier stage on issues where they, can more make a difference rather than listening to the things that we're already heavily engaged in, I took that as marching orders, and in consultation with Ira and a few other folks, we thought this would be an excellent time to roll out the Windows Privacy Initiative, the Windows Privacy Standard, a variety of different concepts to you with the hope that you can actually have some impact on here. So with that, I would like to present Jeffrey Friedberg, who is the director of the Windows privacy effort here, and I will let him take it from there.
Thank you. And I guess hopefully I'm the last speaker today, and then we head off to dinner, which is why I'm here. No. Actually, I've been working the privacy space for about a year and a half, and learned the hard way about some of the things that people care about. And for our talk today, I thought we would cover a couple of things. One is to share with you what I perceive our motivation is for thinking more deeply about privacy, and then to give you a brief history of some of the privacy issues and efforts that have happened prior to this Windows Privacy Initiative, and then go into what it is we're actually doing for Windows. And then I'd like to tap your brain a little bit about the external perceptions about things like P3P. And I keep falling into this issue of objective versus subjective trust. And I'd like to float some ideas to you to see how you feel about that. It would be great to actually get some advice and some counseling. So without further ado, and of course this is interactive. If you do have questions, please let me know if there's something you want me to drill into. But the high-level motivation, from what I can tell, is that it really comes down to a business issue. Erosion of trust can hurt sales. And we know this for a fact because we had this phone home issue happen last year. And it became a major deployment blocker in certain areas. I'm sure people have talked about this in the other talks. If they haven't, let me just touch on it briefly. But places like the CIA and people who have managed environments really start to worry about any time their computer starts doing things on its own and phoning into, say, Microsoft or some other site. And even people like University of Florida, which doesn't sound like they have something terribly sensitive, were very concerned about maintaining their HIPAA compliance for health information. And if they weren't sure exactly what our system did, they couldn't make strong statements about whether they could be HIPAA compliant, and therefore they blocked our deployments of XP. There's something like $100 million worth of sales that were being blocked, at least in just these cases. And if you actually start digging into this issue, it isn't just simply a question of phoning home. It was really kind of a higher level issue of trust. And it started with scary EULA language. Some press person actually got a Windows update saying you should update this software, you've got some updates available, and decided to read the EULA that came along with that. And they said, oh my God, look what this EULA says. And in the section having to do with DRM, the Digital Rights Management, we actually asked for all sorts of rights. And that's not atypical for legal to want to get certain rights because we need to modify certain things on a machine. But the way it was written was so broad that it really scared the pants off of this guy. And he wrote a number of articles about it, which then spun a whole bunch of people wondering about what else do we do and things like that. So issues tend to snowball when you have these kinds of problems. And clearly, automatically downloading anything onto a managed system is sort of counter to it being managed. So we need to be very careful about such things. The other motivations, of course, is that it's a huge issue with big stakes. And having been involved with the original consent decree with the DOJ, we were worried about things like the EU privacy probe. They're actively, Article 29 groups actively looking at spyware and media players, and we're, of course, under an FCC consent decree. So we certainly don't want our, software in a stop-ship situation. It could be very painful for us. And, of course, on the positive side, I believe that if we do privacy right, it can be a market differentiator. And we've seen a couple of examples of this, and it'd be nice to repeat that experience as much as possible, where people actually say, hey, I like what this system is doing because I feel more comfortable with it. And those, of course, soft things, but they are very important to the final bottom line in our EPS. So in the past, I mentioned this phone home issue. And what we did about it at that time was to immediately redraft our EULA and try to narrow its scope. I mean, clearly, when you're in a legal position, you'd like to get as much rights as you can. And I think the way our language was worded was something like, we could do anything we want anytime we wanted to on your system. It wasn't exactly that quote, but it was equivalent to those rights. And so we very much narrowed the scope down to just specifically what we needed to do. In the case of DRM, it was things like revocation lists that needed to get onto the person's system. In the case of when something was revoked, it was only the capability of playing back protected content that was compromised, not other things. And we weren't very clear about that at all. So it sounded very scary. And this is a good lesson about this interplay between what we say in EULAs and what we say in privacy statements or the disclosures. It's kind of, you need a holistic view when you think about trust. And getting those two things to reconcile are actually pretty important.
If I could just jump in with another historical piece of information. I mean, the fact that we wrote a 180-page white paper explains why we had a scary EULA. Because if you go to legal, if a client comes to legal and says, write me the licensing provision that covers this, and you say, what's in the product? What does it do? And they say, I don't know. Then you get a scary EULA provision. And then when you finally tell them, well, figure out what's in it, and it turns out that they have to spend 6 months and write a 180-page white paper, then something's broken in the design process. I'm not saying this only to defend the legal department, but you do get a incredibly broad and expansive and oppressive licensing provision when the lawyer doesn't know what the hell that they're trying to cover, because the product group doesn't know what's in the product.
Yeah, just very basic issues we'll get to in a minute. So when we actually did a thorough, a more deeper analysis of what was there, we found about 28 components that actually did phone home for various reasons. So we quickly added some controls that would mitigate some of that, including turning off DRM, which was really ironic because DRM is the very technology that the University of Florida could have used to protect their medical records, right? So here they are disabling the very technology we invest in to protect their data. And so there's a big mismatch between how people perceive what's being built and what happens on their systems. We did embark on this 108-page white paper, which is what it turned out to be. And that was actually pretty critical because in some cases we really couldn't add the controls and we're kind of in a hard spot because the product had already been released. So having this paper that fully described what we did at least starts heading towards transparency, which is still a very key concept for a lot of people. Even if you have certain practices, if you can be really clear about them and upfront about them, then at least you know what's going on and you can make your own judgment call about whether it's really a problem or not and what the intent is. So these kinds of things really do help. And I've sat in on a couple of meetings, sometimes with the top military brass of Turkey or with these University of Florida folks, and when we ask them the question, how are things now about this issue, they don't bring it up as the key issue. They still are worried about it, and they still want to see continued improvement in this area. But at least I think we sort of turned the corner. But it was certainly not a very elegant way to do it, having to jump through flaming hoops to write the paper and not really even having all the controls we should. So the other event that happened, which I'm intimately familiar with because I worked in the Windows Media division and worked very closely with the Windows Media Player team, was the fiasco that happened last year, which actually got me this job. And what happened was that we were, my boss came to me and basically said, Jeff, I think privacy might be a big issue. Why don't you start looking into this in addition to your other objectives? And so I wasn't sure exactly what that meant, but within 2 weeks there was this atomic bomb that went off in our backyard where a privacy expert or advocate brought up a big issue, and it was stemmed from this. We basically added a new feature to the player, which was to get metadata for DVDs. We had in the past collected kind of cool metadata for CDs, like the album art or lyrics, and this made the experience much more interesting for customers. And so we thought, wouldn't it be nice to have DVD chapter information so you could quickly navigate to the chapters? We didn't think it was a really big deal. And our privacy statement, which we'd written over, we've had one for over a year and a half, so it wasn't something new. We just left this thing out. But a privacy expert said, you know what? Microsoft can really track what you watch, because he took out a packet sniffer and he found very, very simply low-hanging fruit, the fact that we were exchanging a GUID as part of this process, which was really just what's a very typical anonymous visitor GUID for just tracking unique visitors to a site. But we didn't document the scenario because we left out that word. We collect CD metadata. We didn't add and DVD metadata. It basically left a door open for any conjecture about what we did. So he, of course, turned to his press friends, and they wrote an article saying, you know what, your secret behavior can be discovered. particularly the kind of porn you might be watching. Your spouse could easily figure out what's going on, or perhaps the RIAA will come with a SWAT team and beat your door down because of the pirated copies of MP3s that you've got. And this, of course, made great press copy, which is what they're after, is interesting topics, and this is an interesting topic. So, of course, we replied saying, you know what, I don't see why this is really a big deal. We don't collect any of this personally identifiable information. This is what our thinking was, but in fact, we did. And it was actually a bug. And again, this same privacy advocate had pulled out a sniffer and found that there was an email address somehow mixed up with all this. And we said, how did that get there? And it turns out it was pretty innocent on our part, but it's still a bug. Our Windows Media Player uses windowsmedia.com as a service, and it provides cool, interesting content for people to access. You can sign up for a newsletter. And we were very careful to use the MSN newsletter service at an arm's length. It was 2 different sites. It was completely 2 different databases. We used their service, but somehow that service, this newsletter service, reflected back in some return value the email address it was given. And that got stuffed in the server log of this metadata service, because that's what they do. There's these IIS logs that just sit around and collect all the traffic, including IP addresses. So suddenly we have IP address plus visitor unique GUID plus email address all commingled together. So the guy was right. And this just shows that we really don't understand how to test for things like this and design for things like this. It was clearly a big problem. And one other thing they brought up was, this metadata that you're collecting is actually cached on the machine. And, quite frankly, the way this thing was built originally is that there was one media library for all users. So it wouldn't have been that hard to write a shareware application that a junior runs to see what daddy or mommy's been watching in their spare time in terms of looking at the cache and figuring out what they've been watching. So this is, of course, really scary. It took about 2 weeks to fix this problem in terms of going back and forth with the press. I think there were 12 articles written. I know I got very little sleep during that period of time. And the big summary, of course, is this fire drill was incredibly painful because it certainly reinforces the perception that we're not trustworthy. And it was clearly a catalyst for conspiracy theories. They were picking on all sorts of stuff about what we might be doing. And I was seriously considering changing my email address to Jeffrey F. at Area 51 at Microsoft, because it was clearly that we were doing all these evil things, and they just don't trust us. Of course, it leaves us open to penalties and legal action, which is the big ticket item. But internally, it's very disruptive to get these privacy issues coming in when you're not prepared. I had 94 emails the first day, and I pulled in about 20 people in order to help me fix this problem. And in particular, I asked questions. I said, can you just tell me what's in the cookie, and can you tell me what this GUID is and how long it lives? And every person I asked, I got a different answer. Whether it was the dev or the program manager or the task person or the program manager, group program manager, or the POM of the group, nobody had this information in a form ready to go. Because I got the call, they said I had 2 hours to respond before it hit the press. And in 2 hours, it's very difficult to find the right people in a technology space and get the answer that you need. People are just not developing software this way. They're not documenting this information, and they're not thinking about it in a privacy context. So, sure enough, I ended up turning the privacy statement within 24 hours simply to bring it up to full compliance. But it was very unsure about exactly what was in and out of the cookie. And I think also it was clear to me that the response wasn't coordinated. There were a lot of different people messaging externally. I mean, not only myself, but we had some senior people messaging to the press because they felt they needed to say something very quickly. In fact, they started to apologize for things that they didn't really need to apologize for. And then one person would say something, and it would be clear that we're sending mixed messages. So the press was showing how we were lying, just in our inconsistency of how we messaged what we did. So in order to not have this happen again, it was important to establish some kind of strategy. And this is the strategy within the division I was in that we set up. And the holistic strategy really has 4 major points. It was to optimize a reactive privacy response, and in particular, creating some kind of privacy response team and setting up a process to improve this whole effectiveness, because it was very inefficient the way that it was done. And I'm not going to go into in great detail, but it was clear that there were really 5 different individuals getting involved with any privacy issue. There were the investigators, the people who look into it, the people who author a response to that in their native tongue. There are the reviewers of that response to make sure it's right. There are the approvers that take the heat for whether or not it's correct. And there are the communicators that might have a polished way of engaging the press, for example. And there are these different privacy modes these response modes you can use. I mean, you can update your statement, you could change your code, you could try to evangelize on the Hill. I mean, you could do any number of things. I identified about 12 different ways you might respond at any one moment, and we were doing 5 simultaneously on this one set of issues. So having a coordinated way to do this with the call down lists, it's not rocket science, but it's something we didn't do. And it's nice, when you think about it when it's not happening, to try to do something differently the next time so it doesn't happen that way again. The other thing is proactively addressing compliance during development. I mean, clearly doing anything early is a good thing. And you need people who, what we call, butt in seat, somebody who really owns the problem. So you need these people, we'll call them privacy leads for lack of a better name, whose job it is to make sure that the components get analyzed and these practices get documented in a reasonable and standard way so you can get to the data. And that they should hold reasonable reviews. For example, there should be a high-level review before code complete, because you might be in the weeds. People who are not privacy aware often want to take extra data. In fact, there's been a long history of companies thinking that the data was there for the taking, that users' data was a great way to make money in other places. And we know from experience that users fundamentally feel ripped off when they're not privy to the value proposition and you don't tell them what they're getting in return. So it's just a bad practice. And having these reviews early could stop these bad features from getting in at the beginning. Then, of course, before you do any kind of public release like a beta, there's got to be as close to a thorough review as the final and a disclosure that matches what's going on. Because once you let people know what's going on, they'll write the stories about it once it's public, even if it's beta. And I don't think a lot of people here in the company felt that beta was that way. I think they felt beta was like, not a big deal, and once we get to final, it really matters. And that's not the case in privacy. You tip people off to your practices early. And then, of course, these things would have been a lot not as bad as they became if people trusted us more. And so we really need to find holistic ways to increase end-user trust. Part of that might be to go back to the UBI, the out-of-the-box experience, where people first encounter our stuff, or our whole opt-in paradigm of how we engage them, or the quality and the type of disclosures we make. These are all possibilities for increasing end-user trust. But it's something we've got to do in addition to these other things, because it's an amplifier if you don't. And finally, investigating some kind of Windows privacy architecture, because a lot of this stuff is manual and somewhat painful. And this is where research and advanced development come into play in terms of what are the best ways to get privacy practices reflected in the code itself so that they roll up more dynamically. Quite frankly, I've written quite a few privacy statements since I've had this responsibility. And it's a very brittle process. I basically, or the people I work with, we take a snapshot of the system, which means you have to be a global expert on the entire software stack and be able to drill down sufficiently low enough to understand the data classification of what's going on down there. And then you've got to bubble it up, roll it all up, and then somehow present it in a form that will resonate with users. And once you do that, within 3 weeks, it's out of date. Because somebody did a software update of a lower level component and changed the behavior. So you're a liar again in the statement. So, privacy statements today are fundamentally bad instruments of disclosure. They are brittle, and they don't reflect really what's going on, and are very hard to keep up to date. Just a comment and a call for action in the part of academia in terms of coming up with better ways to, within our compilers and all those sorts of other ways of making declarative statements about privacy. So, a couple of ways to increase end-user trust. What is protecting privacy by default? I mean, clearly, if you're telling the person, I'm really going to do my best not to have your data go where it shouldn't, such as not having this media library shared between yourself and your kids, that's a good start. I'm in favor of things like just-in-time opt-in, where you present a value proposition at the time this feature is going to be used, so you wait until the last minute and you've got great context. So a good example would be you insert the DVD and it says, I could get you the chapter information if you want, but I do need to call Microsoft to do that. Is that okay? And so coming up with these kind of strategies and these fundamental ways to do this is a good thing. Then, of course, providing adequate controls. I mean, clearly, if you have certain practices and there's no way to turn them off, users get very frustrated. I'd say more to the point, enterprises and administrators get more frustrated. They have an absolute need, and they will get fired if they don't maintain the integrity of their managed systems. And we don't really provide them the right level of controls or the right hierarchy of controls. And then finally, you've got to have the facts when they're needed. So you need detailed disclosure when it's asked for. So when you have a privacy expert or a governmental agency coming in asking you for this stuff. You've got to have it at your fingertips. So for Windows Media Player, the next version, 9 series, we actually put our money where our mouth was. We actually followed this practice, and we actually put end users in control right from the start. We gave them a first-run privacy options dialog, which rolled up all the things that they might be worried about. I'll show you that in a minute. We actually changed the architecture. We made the library per user instead of global for the machine, where you could actually apply the encryption technologies in the file system so you can have your own unique library and not worry about your other kids and users getting at it. We added a lot of the missing privacy controls, even ones where we say don't collect history. Even MRUs, the file lists become very sensitive when you've got a media player and you're watching some porn or something like that. If you leave this machine and somebody else comes on and they pull down the list, they see what you've been watching. And of course, having the appropriate group policy, so in an enterprise case, you can actually turn this stuff more easily. And of course, protecting privacy by default. We had some options, some privacy issues relating to IDs. We had a unique ID in the player for maintaining state when you do pay-per-view to a service. Sometimes the connection would be lost, and we needed something that lasted longer than a session. So we had this ID, but unfortunately, this same ID was exposed in our ActiveX control interfaces, which meant that it became a super cookie, if you're familiar with that concept. Very bad thing. It means you could be tracked for across long periods of time by many websites. So now that thing's off by default. There's no point in having it. It's actually not off. It's actually anonymous. We provide this anonymous ID. We use that until someone actually needs a unique one when they use a service that they need to actually do pay-per-view with or something like that, which makes a lot more sense. So this is what it looks like. If you were a user interface designer, you'd probably barf at this point. But the point is at the top we were able to have a privacy message that basically says, we really care about your privacy, and you know what, this player is going to go out to the internet to do various things, and you should make some choices here. And so the typical paradigm in an all-in-one mode is to list the privacy options you've got, pre-check the ones that you think are safe, don't check the ones that are going to be sensitive data or make people nervous, provide more information. And then notice the privacy statement's back there in a tab, because quite frankly, nobody reads these privacy statements. Or if they do, it's because they really want to. And if you simply make it discoverable, it's sufficient. We used to make people click through privacy statements as if they were EULAs. And I think that was just our wishful thinking that somehow users would actually read it, or that it gave us some additional coverage that people actually accepted our privacy practices. I think it's a very bad thing to do, because users really don't resonate with that. And what was interesting here is that we did this for beta, this style, and we expected to go back at final to clean it all up and reduce the noise and make it really pretty. But we got this response. Did this make a difference? We got this great press. Microsoft breaks new ground on privacy. It's taking privacy very seriously. The Chicken Littles of the world who are expecting this player to significantly invade their privacy will be disappointed. What a huge improvement. I can strongly recommend upgrading. And the last one substantiates the fact that this can be a market differentiator. This person, Washington Post says, a refreshingly clear explanation of your privacy options and no sneaky attempts to spam you with marketing pop-ups. Other media software developers, yes, real networks, that means you, could learn from this. Yes?
Was that previous screen image the example of the defaults?
Yes, actually was.
Could you go back?
Absolutely.
So the default is to save the history of files.
And that's an interesting point because, well, I should let you ask your question.
Well, I thought I heard you about 5 minutes ago explain how people weren't
so what was important, you see, there's this dilemma, which is that there's a certain expected behavior of applications. People are used to having these file lists. They're used to having them show up. What they're not used to having is the ability to clear out that history or not have it happen, or to what we call erase your tracks. So our interpretation of this is that although, in a strict sense, you probably shouldn't have it checked, it's for the majority of users, it's not the expected behavior. And so we do make it prominent in terms of this as being here, and it is pre-selected. But you could certainly turn it off and also clear the history easily after that.
So it seems inconsistent with this. I'm not going to get the dogma right, but it's security by default, security by default.
Privacy by default.
Privacy
should be unchecked.
Well, you could debate it. It was certainly something we debated quite heavily. And at beta, we went with this and sort of as a trial balloon. We got all this great press, and they said specifically, people are very critical of us, Every one of the privacy issues I had been concerned with in the past was an opt-in option. So they weren't really concerned, at least the people doing the reviews were concerned with this. And I think in an academic sense, we could be concerned with it. And it does actually fall into this category of potential sensitivity.
It seems like it's unchecked by default, and people discovered that the device doesn't work the way they're used to, and they had to check something. It might actually educate them a little bit about privacy, because they'd have to think about the fact that, oh my God, my normal operation is allowing people to intrude.
Yeah, you're correct. I think the feedback we sort of got was, I want the ability to remove this list when I'm done, but I want it around when I'm using it. So maybe we need a different kind of opt-in or a different kind of way of expressing that, which is something like erase. Maybe it would be something like this. Erase my file used list when I leave. And it's checked on because you want it erased. And you have to actually uncheck it if you want to preserve the list between invocations. And that might be a better, consistent message. Yes?
Where is this stored?
When is this presented?
Where is this stored? On the device or is it the remote site?
It's all local.
It's cached, right?
It's cached locally.
Yes, it's just cached in one of the keys in your registry.
And the operating system underneath makes sure that this is erased.
It doesn't at the moment. We would have to change it.
Suppose that you do that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that would certainly up the ante for privacy by default.
How is it going to be erased?
It could simply have the semantics that after you leave the program, in terms of execution, the file list disappears. That's the standard mode.
That's what I mean. How does it disappear?
It doesn't today. We would have to erase it.
Suppose that you do that.
Yes.
How did it disappear? Remember, Oliver North thought that the email disappeared too.
Well, one of the features we wanted to add to the new platform was erase your tracks. And part of the problem with erase your tracks is that it's very hard to do. There's all sorts of places data gets swirled away. And it's very hard to make a strong statement saying, I really erased your tracks. Even to the extent of erasing it off a disk, you can find it there again by looking at the magnetic patterns. I mean, you could find it. So
you better be careful with that.
Which is why we don't have an erase your tracks feature. So you have to also decide on the level of privacy that you're trying to invoke here. Are you trying to protect privacy between individuals in a home? Or are you trying to protect privacy in the context of governmental, of a court order, having someone subpoena your machine and having taken it away? What kind of scrubbing are you looking for? And I could tell you right now, we cannot at any time suggest that we do the scrubbing for the court order, because it's just not possible and we'll never get it right. We can, however, suggest that this state could be removed so the next user can't easily find it. A regular, normal user, not a power user.
Is the history specific to one user or to all users of the player?
One user.
So why is this really an issue? I mean, for someone to look, they would have to impersonate the user in the first place.
So if you were in a kiosk situation, okay, and you wanted to just borrow someone's machine or you're just sitting there, you may not have your own unique account. And there's no easy way to sort of remove your state in the system.
The configuration would probably have... Then the right thing is perhaps to make it more complicated and make it depend on whether it's a shared machine or not, right?
Certainly. I think when we try to do design, we think about scenarios. And you really got to come up with what scenario is it that's going to really provide some value to end users. One scenario is people going into an internet cafe and wondering whether it's a safe thing to do if they use some other person's equipment. Or even if they use their own equipment on the network and stuff like that. Are they somehow being watched and so on and so forth. So those are real scenarios for people, and addressing those might be important. Another one is in a family situation, although good practice suggests that each user should have their own account, so there are these natural boundaries, because that's where we draw the line. After that, anything within your own account is up for grabs. So you can make a strong statement like that and try to educate users not to have a practice where you let your kids suddenly jump on. But I could tell you that within my own household, I've seen my wife get up or I get up and suddenly my kid jumps on just very quickly and has already gotten into their game without logging out or switching users. And it just happens that way for expediency. So it's just something to think about.
One of the things that I find most interesting about this is that the statements, at least the top three, they don't tell people anything about the privacy implications of the choice.
So
right?
It's a good point about how far can you go in an initial opt-in. What's critical is that there's a learn more. Okay? And you have to, the trick in what I'll call creating an intelligent summary is getting the user aware enough of two things, the value proposition and the privacy impact. So
the value proposition isn't there. I mean, it's retrieve media information for CDs and DVDs from the internet, and if it said, by sending us your name, address, and kid's date of birth, right? That's one value proposition. If it says, by sending a unique one-time session ID, right? They're just two very different value propositions.
Well, presumably that's into more information.
I know that's what I'm just saying, that most people aren't going to look at
But by the way, I am not holding this up as the way we should do it.
No, I know you're not.
But
I just find it interesting.
Yes.
I found it interesting, the press that came out about it. When I looked at it, I actually was like, wow, they're really excited about stuff that doesn't really tell you all that much.
Yeah, the two important points about this. One was, at the very top, we say we go to the internet. Because there is this issue of where's this data coming from. And when you say you're going to Microsoft to get this data, then if that's going to trip your filter for, I don't trust Microsoft, I want to know more, they've got the Learn More button, and we disclose all this information about what's in the cookie and the IP address and all this good stuff. So, you've got this trade-off, and you've got to look at the different personas you're trying to address. And, personally, this is a little too dense, doesn't have enough room to provide adequate privacy impact. Okay? And it scares me a little bit, but we ended up getting away with it in the sense that, my God, they really liked it. They thought this was a huge improvement. So it really was bad before. It was terrible before. Yeah. And the fact that it was all right here, all in one place, made they were ecstatic. Because this was transparency to them.
Can I talk about this for a little bit broader theoretical point? Transparency, I think, is very valuable. What we mean when we say transparency is you can see through it to see what you care about. So what this question, I think, quite correctly points out is, I probably would want to know what exactly is being sent through the internet. Incidentally, retrieve media information from the internet to a savvy user would say, well, you've got to send something, at least my IP address. I would imagine to some users it wouldn't mean anything is being compromised at all, because it's retrieved without sending. So one point is, I think, the correct one that maybe more should be included. But the broader point is I think you have to have a theory of what the average user who is concerned about privacy, but who is not so sophisticated that he either knows the background or will click on more information, what it is that he would want to see. So I don't think you can just talk about transparency in the abstract. You have to do it with regard to this understanding of what a typical user wants to see. And one difficulty, well, I'm delighted about the positive press, especially if it presses people to do more for privacy. That's press that's generally written by fairly sophisticated users and writers.
It's totally unfair. I mean, I don't think any users necessarily, average users, found this to be amazing. I really don't think it resonated with them per se at all. But it turns out that maybe they're influenced by the press, by the articles written by the influentials. And so at the end of the day, what they care about is what was written in PC Magazine.
Well, but I think...
or Slashdot or wherever, right? Wherever it happens to be.
But I think there are two meanings of care about. One is care about when deciding whether to buy and like your software, which is, of course, very important. The other is care about for purposes of their privacy. So that's why I think you need an underlying theory behind the word transparency. What is it that users care about? And I think users care more about send information than retrieve information as such. And the send information is here implicit. So this doesn't necessarily show that there's anything wrong with this particular thing.
Just realize, at the very top it says data is exchanged over the internet, meaning back and forth.
Where does
At the very top. To deliver the enhanced experience, data is exchanged over the internet and may be saved on your computer. So there's data going back and being saved and restored. So, yeah, you're right.
I appreciate what you're saying, but a typical person is going to breeze through this. They're not going to read why.
Without rat-holing on this one topic, I do want to point something out. I'm sure people talked about the Longhorn personas here. Has that come up at all? No, not yet? So there's like 12 personas, at least. And their heads are plastered everywhere, in the bathroom, on elevator doors, and each persona has a different shtick. They're all, one is the active mom, one is the IT professional, one is this, one is that. And when I think about disclosure, I think about the appropriate disclosure as one that's customized by persona. Okay, so they get the data that they want. And in fact, if there was a privacy zealot knocking on my door, I'd actually want to give them all the details that they want so they don't have to call me. Because I'm willing to disclose it all. It's not like we're hiding anything. It's just that that data is not very useful or relevant to someone like the active mom. And so choosing and finding out ways to provide the data in a form where they can get to it without it making the interface too noisy is a real art. All right, so yes, but we'll start with that one.
Maybe going a bit further on that, I think that for many users, you have done this wrong in the sense that they would like this to be under playback experience, not under privacy options. Because if they want to get information from the internet, they don't find it.
So it turns out there's two opposing goals. One is if you choose the strategy of maximum context for an opt-in, then what you're doing is you're waiting until that situation is going to show up. So the only thing the user has to realize is, like, for them to do what they want to do, like get the DVD metadata, or have this enhanced experience, or to load presets or whatever, you say at that moment, here's the situation. I can do this cool thing for you, but it will cost you this. It'll take this, and you can be get a little more detail and get into it a little bit better. I call that a fragmented set of disclosure, because ultimately you get one of these little pop-ups everywhere, and only at the time that you eventually see it. Now, that doesn't actually drive home a trust message, other than sort of an Uber kind of feeling like, well, I guess Microsoft is really trying hard. The other approach is to actually message privacy as a thing, as a brand, as a theme for Windows, or trust for that matter. And you actually say, we think trust is important, privacy is important, and here's what we mean by that, and here's a bunch of choices you can make to show that we really mean it. And so this opt-in is not by technology. This opt-in is by privacy theme, which is why it looks funny, because it starts off with privacy options and we care and those kind of messages, versus just get to the nuts and bolts of what feature I can get and what it's going to cost me and what's my impact. So they're opposite ends, and you can move back and forth along the continuum. Yes?
Follow up on something that Eugene said. I think he's pointing to, in the first box there, a feeling that for whoever the average person is, the concept of that the information is being sent is going to be more salient in terms of privacy than the concept of retrieve. And what Eugene's pointing to is the fact that an average user may not realize that the internet is an interactive telecommunications medium, and so on and so forth. And then I heard you saying in your reply, well, we're thinking about a long-arm project, 12 different focus groups, and this and that. And so my kind of, I guess, follow-up question to that exchange would be, do you work with, are the Longhorn 12 groups, or whoever it is this something that's kind of developed at an abstract level? Did it come out through a focus group?
We actually, when we do all our user interface testing, we actually pull in representatives of each of the personas. We pre-classify them, and then we see how they feel about it.
And then can you, in other words, test?
Absolutely, and we could find that
intuition that sent would be more salient in terms of the
certain. Yeah, correct. Now realize that, I mean, if you try to get down to what people really care about, for some personas, it's, will I get spam? Okay? Which isn't really the data being sent. It's the fact that after the data sent, I get something back that annoys me. So I mean, you've got to be careful on the granularity of what you start to care about, because if you put on the right hat, at the end of the day, if someone's about to load a piece of software, they might ask a high-level question, is this spyware? And can you answer that question? Right? And is it bad spyware? Because some spyware is software that does product improvement, where it sends data back to its author so that it can make better software, and it's actually innocuous. Yes?
Further to Eugene's point, there's no reliable theory of transparency for us to consult.
That's why you have to make one.
But we are.
Yeah.
The theory is Jeff's intuition at this point. Because I'll tell you, I've met with privacy advocates, I've met with government officials, and all they're giving me is their intuition. I've met when we were going through the whole cookie crisis, and then using P3P and designing certain features into ID6. I mean, state AGs were playing software designers, and they were telling me that the first, when you set up a new machine, the first box that you should see should address cookies. That should be the first user experience. And we said, thanks anyway, we'll design our own. So it's like, give us a theory.
Well, no, but I think Longhorn may facilitate it by identifying that transparency doesn't mean one thing. It means 12 different things, or maybe more things. But I guess the one thing is, what you're pointing out, you have to build a theory because otherwise people will foist it upon you and claim that it's the right theory because it corresponds to their particular vision. So you don't want that to happen. You should be able to say, well, no, we've got a better understanding of transparency. The next point is just to keep in mind whenever you're looking at any one of those items, you have to ask, what is it likely to communicate to at least various sets of typical users? And I should say, I think this is a very good first cut.
Yeah.
But I think it more illustrates this problem than it.
So realize that this happened prior to Longhorn and the Longhorn effort. And now that I'm actually in the Longhorn team and I'm a little more savvy to the personas, I mean, Abby, who's this active mom, would barf at this. I mean, she wouldn't.
Can you spend a minute to say what the 12 personas are?
Yeah. If I could, there's a whole. I mean, it's a whole topic. But I see if I can remember what they were.
All up. You have
the active characters in Gilligan's Island.
I remember the active mom who uses AOL and a bunch of other things.
What's the idea that all customers form 12 categories and?
The idea, I think, is that we've done a very poor job in the past of trying to address, having one size fits all, and not really hitting the mark for anybody. Right? And that's the risk you take by doing that kind of strategy. So wouldn't it be better if everyone in their head had some name and a person in their mind, including like the kid at home is actually like the IT professional for the home, right? And how people really behave in their home settings and what you want to offer them. It's kind of an interesting dilemma because the parents want to offer impose parental controls, and yet the kid has admin privileges and install software. So it's really weird, right? I mean, you got to kind of think about these scenarios of how they really work. And of course, in the IT space, there are people who are very mobile and are constantly moving around, and there are people who use a lot of office productivity stuff, and there are people who need to keep the systems going, and their needs are all different. So what we try to do when we come up with scenarios, we try to figure out which ones are the ones we want to hit for the markets we're going, for the target market individuals. And in some cases, Abby isn't going to be setting group policy. It's just not something she does. But the question is, if she saw this dialogue, would it resonate with her at all? And the answer is probably not. It's too wordy, it's too noisy, it's too complex. It's probably going to hit next. Like
something you use internally to make your evaluations. Is that those 12 people, or is this?
Yes, we use it in design decisions constantly, and in the specs themselves. And we actually write in the names of the people we're addressing with the scenario. Like Ichiro is going to do X, and we have to somehow enable Ichiro to do that easily. And that might be the IP professional. Yeah?
Do you have a persona for people who like it the way it used to be?
I don't know. I didn't actually come up with the personas, but I appreciate the attempt at trying to understand in a more broad sense the fact that there are these spikes of desirability in the user interface, and they're all a little different. There's overlap, but it's different. And I would love something that configured itself.
Do you have wheel group?
A what?
Wheel group for Unix hackers?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
They don't use wheel.
Wheel?
Yes.
Well,
W-H-E-E-L?
this isn't even a rat hole. Just keep it in mind.
Okay. So,
I think what's amazing about all of this is that we have trained everyone to know what cookies are.
Yeah, exactly. You know the
That's
they are evil things.
What is the, if we were thinking about this as a secure by, okay, we know what the defaults are, and those don't appear to necessarily track onto the secure by from a privacy perspective. Retrieve media information from CDs and DVDs from the internet. What data is being exchanged to do that?
what's actually, what do you want to know what's actually exchanged?
Yeah.
Aside from your social security number and everything else that we get? It's really quite innocuous. The thing I don't like, there is a visitor GUID for windowsmedia.com that services all the metadata requests. Now, it does that in order to just track the load and the traffic to understand how many unique users are hitting it, et cetera. It doesn't attempt to correlate, and it doesn't correlate this information. It has a statement about that in its privacy statement. But under court order, somebody could try to subpoena our logs and do that correlation, right? So it's not a great thing to hold your hat on. And then it's basically got the ID of the content you're trying to get the metadata for. And that ID is a hash, which is formed of, it's either a TOC, which is a table of contents for a CD, since CDs don't have any unique IDs for their content. You actually have to take each of the tracks and their time lengths and use that as a big hash and use it as an index. That's really lame, but that's how it works. And of course, you get collisions, because there are some that map to the same value, and then we help the user figure out which ones map. Some rock thing gets mapped to some symphony, and who knows. And then on DVDs, it's a little better because there's actually a unique ID or a UPC or something like that that's a little more unique. And so we use heuristics to kind of come up with the best hits and best matches, and we try for like 99.9% hit rates. So we come back almost always correct the first time. And then users can correct this information. There's a feedback loop. So the data that goes up is just simply the ID, and what gets captured is just that people are hitting these kind of content. So we actually know like the top 10 most popular songs.
But you don't keep the grid in connection to what content it is.
It is in a log, and so it is there. We don't currently mine it.
And it is a persistent ID.
Yeah, that's the thing I don't quite like, is that the visitor IDs typically in cookies live for the life of the cookie. And therefore, that's pretty long. It's certainly longer than a session.
When people click retrieve media or don't turn this up, what they're doing is they're saying, give Microsoft a GUID that's established that's going to always relate to my machine or to this particular application, and give you information about every CD or DVD that I'm looking at.
Yeah, so in the disclosures, in the statements and stuff, it's a big cookie section. It says, within the cookie, there is this ID, so we can maintain our systems and improve them, et cetera. And it's anonymous. It's not correlated to any PII or any personally identifiable information. In fact, in this whole experience, there is no PII at all that moves across that trust boundary between the local machine and the remote service. But that said, people are still very nervous because the content they're watching is sensitive, right? Be it porn or this pirated content. So they're just really worried about it.
Connected back.
Certainly could. And of course, the IP addresses are there as well. And so we all know dynamic IP addresses over a short time window are still static.
So it seems to me that this actually identifies at least two separate things to what transparency could mean. One thing that it could mean is what information about me is being sent. And sometimes that's all that people care about. For example, if they say Social Security numbers are being sent, they may say, oh, that's kind of scary, partly because we see no reason why that would be done, partly because we have some idea of what could be done with our Social Security numbers. But what they really want to know, it seems to me, is what can be done. And there are some things, like if you tell people we're sending a global unique ID, many of the Longhorn personae are not going to understand what that means. Rather, what they will care about, or what they should be caring about, is what can be done with it. And actually, that could be a very broad set of things.
So your use, obviously, of data as a person collecting it is your responsibility to disclose, clearly and unambiguously to people in a language they understand.
Well, that's right. So one possible explanation there might be this would permit people to collect, to figure out to map essentially all of the things that you've downloaded, although not necessarily to your name, but to your IP address, which we don't do, which could conceivably be done. That's the kind of thing.
Yeah, except that you don't want to go spinning all the possibilities, because it's really not the appropriate way to go about
and therein lies the question. Because you could, fair enough, as a psychological matter, that may be right. But from the perspective of the user, if you imagine sort of a user who thinks about privacy as much as he would like to think about privacy, most people care about privacy but do not actually invest the time and effort into figuring out what the possible implications is. But if you think about somebody, if you sat him down and said, well, what do you really want to know? He'd say, what I really want to know is I want to know all of those scenarios. It may be bad business for you to really throw people's noses in.
Let's back up. You may say that in an academic sense, but 200 million users are sitting there with their kids pulling on their shirt strings saying, load this screensaver, or pop in this DVD to play the games on it. And suddenly this thing pops up saying, I'm a new piece of software, I'm loading on your system, is that okay? And it's like, you don't even know, because you have to load the thing just to see the privacy statement. So it's too late, because the privacy statement's opted them in to data tracking. And it's like, oh my God, this is just horrible.
No, I agree with you, but the point, I think another way to say the point, right, is that what I would want to see happen, like you said, okay, so there are these log files. Well, why? For how long? The people don't want to have to know that because they don't want it to be true. So they actually want to be able to retrieve the media information and not to face the risk. And so the question is, how do you limit the risk? If you're not doing anything with the data, that's great.
Okay, so I have this sort of bar, or this vision for how this should work, and that there's these different tiers of privacy information. Just for simplicity, let's just say there's three. And the first tier is sort of the corporate level tier of information where we say we care about your privacy, and in general we don't do anything, and blah, blah, blah. And that's very common text that people can see and read. The second tier of privacy information is what a standard population would find reasonable and expected in terms of what you need to tell them so they kind of know what's going on without the technical details.
But I'm actually not talking about the information. I'm talking about what the risk is, regardless of what you're telling them.
Okay, so let's keep going. So the third tier is what's really going on. Privacy zealots love that. You need to offer it. Now, how do you translate this information? How do you translate this information into risk? Which is, I think, your point, right?
Well, when you talk about information, I think the information that the consumer wants to know, or the information you have.
No, I think what the consumer needs or wants to know at the end of the day is. No, not really. I think they're more concerned about viruses and things destroying their system and then getting spam later. And, there are these net effects that you read about in the paper that they're worried about. That they're going to get calls during dinner.
But also they're worried about the particular privacy things. They're worried that somewhere, somehow, somebody's got a database which shows that they've been watching porn. And that database may be available to law enforcement, or the database may be available to Microsoft itself, although Microsoft may promise not to use it this way. Now, again, maybe at some point you say as a business matter you don't want to scare people that much. But it seems to me that more than just we are sending the GUID, what they really want to know is what the consequences, what the risk is, what the possible bad things that could happen to them are, and what the likelihood of each are. That, I think, that's why people care about privacy, because they care about it not as an abstraction.
So let me ask
you something.
Let me ask you something. When you go and get a prescription from the drugstore, do you read every side effect that's listed on the sheet? Okay. How many people in a real? I believe this audience is biased. So in a real scenario of real people going to drugstores and getting.
Ask us. How many people do you read the prescription?
Take it to the next level. How many of you ask your pharmacist to give you a statement that if they store this prescription in the database, here's the series of risks that you might run, and maybe you don't want to get your drug prescription. There's a lot of secondary uses for that data that were pre-HIPAA.
I think we're sort of dancing on the head of the pin here, and I'm surprised. In other words, I don't think what Eugene's talking about, no one would ever make it through, ever. There's no way you could do it, forget it. So even if he's right, no one. You monitor how long it takes someone to install the piece of software. By the time you describe all the risks and all the things that might happen and so forth, they're gone. They're out of there. But I do think, and I think the point's been made by a number of people, and to me this is like one place where it seems like there would be a fairly broad level of agreement on a statement that has to do with privacy. The text you can read, like that I can see without my glasses, only talks about retrieving information.
No, I would agree that is a weakness. It's a big weakness. If we critique this particular opt-in, which was done sort of rushed, and we just said, yeah, we'll just put it up there. You're right. There's a better way to describe it. But I would also like to point something out. There's some practical issues of real estate. All right, so for example, I recently did a first-run experience where each user is going to use this stuff for the Media Center edition of Windows. And for those who aren't familiar with that, that's this special SKU of a PC that's set up for media where you can hook it up to your big screen TV and wonderful things happen. HP's made one, a whole bunch of people. And what's interesting is that it presents a 10-foot user experience. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a 10-foot user experience, but you get about 2 lines of text. All right, now, to create a privacy opt-in in 2 lines of text, it's a little more than that, maybe it's 4 lines of text with some buttons at the bottom, is very, very challenging. And so we handcrafted every word that we chose to put down there to highlight the privacy issue, to suggest what data was being sent back to Microsoft. First starting off the value proposition, you can get this great electronic program guide, but, other shoe, we will be tracking which channels you're watching and blah, 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 right? Learn more. So the idea is to have some kind of tagline or something that triggers those that are concerned to look at the more. And you can't possibly put in enough of the nuance in these experiences to fully disclose.
You might not need to put up enough of the nuance, but I think that several people have said it shouldn't be retrieve media information. It should be send. But wait. So the question is send what? You say now we're not sending the email address anymore. Send the global user ID. Send the global user ID. That may be in some respect an improvement because it says send and not just receive, but it isn't a meaningful improvement for most people because most people don't understand what the consequences of the global user ID are. You don't need to enumerate all the consequences, but I do think you need to talk about it in terms of what is the possible danger.
So let me just bring up a more global way to look at this. Okay.
Well, even up front, before they learn more, so they know why they might want to.
So we have different tiers of places we're going to disclose information to people, right? There's that first front door, like this is a front door, where it's your welcome mat, and you get a certain amount of real estate to describe to them what's going on. Clearly, at some point, you can't put everything. You're going to stop at the level of detail, and you're going to offer someone a learn more button, right? You know, or next screen. And so, no, stop. So I'm just saying, there is a hierarchical presentation to the information because of practical limitations of user interface. You just have to accept that. That's a reality. Now we can decide where's the bar for where we break between what's on the front door and what we put after the front door that they have to discover.
I guess
okay?
My point is, what I was trying to say is that the question here, there's a lot of pressure on notice, and I agree with you. And so I'm actually was more interested in, okay, so the person who leaves the box check, what are they actually agreeing to, and have we limited their risk, right, related to getting this value? How great is their risk, and what security?
If we wanted to limit their risk for real, okay, with the box pre-checked, we should not be collecting a GUID in the cookie. Okay? I mean, fundamentally, once that thing's in there, and every transfer is tagged, you know, we're just counting on not getting subpoenaed for that data.
But so my question is that what you're going to do? You know, like that's...
Well, I think to use this as a test case, because we don't want to pick on this one thing and spend all the time on this one particular issue. I think we want to raise this up and say, in general, what's our filter, what's our bar, what's our philosophy, and it very much is to try to protect users and make sure they're empowered to make decisions about their data. It's all about notice and choice. All right? And so the notices have to be sufficient to be accurate and reflect what's going on. And if this one is not accurate, it probably should be changed. Okay? Or the underlying system has to be changed so it is accurate. Right? One or the other. They have to correlate. Would you agree? Is that sort of your point? Am I not hitting your point?
No, the question is, right, so you said, okay, the real answer is that you have a log file that's maintained for, I don't know what period of time.
90 days.
Right, that could be used to identify what people are watching and listening to. Right? And I don't want people to have to choose between getting the media content and having the risk that somebody subpoenas you.
So you could decide that that risk is sufficient, and we could take a policy decision to turn off that box.
No. Or you could remove the ability to relate that information back to the individual.
In other words, the question is, could you provide,
I said we could remove the GUID and not have, well, it makes it harder to run an efficient service because you really are running blind, not knowing the traffic and why you're getting certain peaks and valleys and how things work. So the data is very valuable, and almost any website will be doing this. I mean, I know 99% of the websites do this today. I mean, this is common practice.
I mean, that you're right. To the extent that you want to maintain the ability to do that, then I think you put more pressure on notice, and this isn't sufficient. You got to put something more there.
Correct.
And so my question is, I would much prefer you not to have to put more pressure on notice and to actually reform the practice, right? To change the design so that people don't have to choose between those two things.
So this becomes the tug of war that's in every company, which is, you know, once you realize...
To the extent you want to use the data.
I'm just saying, but you realize that people won't run the service unless they can get their back-end value out of it. And so you end up starting to erode and compromise the value, the internal value proposition within the company for the return on investment of the service.
But I don't know what the back-end is. The back-end value what Dear the Mulligan is doing? Is the back-end value, you know, what? I don't know what the back-end value is.
I think so we can move on. In a big company like Microsoft or any company that's trying to do this, the best approach, and we'll get to it, is sort of a common philosophy around what the rules are. Okay? And if you can spot something that doesn't follow your rules, right, then you can then have this debate and then decide at a VP or senior VP level to ignore the good practice for business reasons and take the heat when someone in the press brings it up, or you are subpoenaed and someone says, you see, told you so. I mean, that's a choice that gets made, you know, by high-level senior people within our company about whether or not these things are changed or not. If we could at least get people to identify when their practices are inconsistent, that's a huge win, because now they're into an exceptions process, which we have, it's a very hard choice to make. And I've seen it made either way, depending on the perceived level of the risk really going to happen, right? So there's this big value, and suddenly there is this risk, but it's so remote, let's go with the big value. And some person makes that judgment call, takes the heat, right? That's why we have hierarchy within the company.
So it's not that at this point, you want to do privacy by design. It's that there's a business reason not to do privacy by design, so you're going to do privacy by disclosure.
So I guess that's an interesting question. If this goes to the heart of can we honor our statement of privacy by design or security by design or whatever these sayings are, the reality is that yes, by design we do these things, but I think there are exceptions. And for example, one exception that happens sort of often is you recognize a flawed design, but yet you're in so late in the development cycle that you choose to ship with that flaw, and then you follow it up later with a service pack that fixes it, and there's a window of exposure, and you accept that risk. You could have stopped the whole thing and made the change, but clearly you have to weigh the value of doing that.
But that's a different kind of business decision.
I don't think so. I think it's very similar in the sense that when you get down to the nuance of this, and we shouldn't be picking on this because it's just one small example.
No, I'm just viewing it as an example.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent where the people providing the service within Microsoft feel compromised by disclosing so much about this that it scares users away, right? That they have to change their practice of not having a visitor GUID, then they might start saying, maybe I don't want to do this anymore, or it's going to cost me X amount more dollars because I can't figure out what's going on in my system. I mean, if the burden will be on them to prove how important that GUID is in the cookie, right?
So, Jeff, are you still doing the historical perspective here? You run that?
So I think I need to move on. I hope you guys don't mind, but
move on.
We have another hour after this. You can talk to me individually because I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on this. So what about this Windows Privacy Initiative? Well, we did this within the Digital Media Division. There was about 600 people who were affected, but there's 15,000 people doing Windows development. And so it's a much bigger scale-up problem, and it's just a fan-out issue. So we took the same basic ideas of the strategy from DMD, and we expanded them a little bit. Number one is that we want to make sure that everyone goes through this lifestyle change where they get it, that privacy is important. And I would love to see basic courses of privacy taught in schools and things like that, and what that syllabus should look like. But we also established a Windows privacy standard, which is very helpful, and I'll talk about that a little later. Also added to the list is industry leadership. I mean, at the moment, I don't think Microsoft is necessarily perceived in any way as a leader in privacy. I think IBM has done a much better job of evangelizing their technologies and going out to customers and talking to them about privacy investments and technologies. So this is a real opportunity for us to make a much bigger splash if we get it right. It's certainly an asset we should be able to take forward. Also, we want to be able to influence public policy better. So what's the organization look like? We've got a hierarchical organization because, if there's just one or two people that know about privacy and 15,000 people, it doesn't work. So we've got 3 tiers. We have a privacy cabinet made up of multiple members, some from LCA, some international, some from development groups, some from Office, all sorts of different places. And they basically set the policies and the standards and things like that other people need to follow, plus the coursework. The privacy leads are identified, and they support sort of a local effort. They support some number of feature teams and components. Within Windows Media, we had 8 or 9 components. Within Windows, there's 600 to 1,000 components. So it's a huge problem to try to get enough traction and expertise in each of these areas where people are actually doing design to influence them. But we're trying to do that. So far, we have about 130 privacy leads within the Windows organization, affecting up to 15,000 feature team members. And of course, the feature teams have got to realize the vision that we have here for privacy and notice and choice. So of course, it's a holistic effort. It's not just a cabinet, but it's all these supporting folks. LCA, we've got our international subs. There's a huge amount of regime-specific issues we need to deal with. Of course, marketing gets involved, government affairs, et cetera. So the process, we tried to simplify it for folks within Windows. Basically, it's 3 phases. First, they create a plan. They get some training. They do some initial assessment of their features. And we try to bubble up the ones that are the most egregious, such as the phone home type scenarios or sensitive data being used. They create a plan. Then they actually go and design for privacy. They do a detailed analysis. And in fact, the coursework for detailed analysis is happening this Friday. And then they mitigate or raise exceptions to whatever they find in terms of it against this Windows standard I was about to tell you about. And then finally, they go and they actually deliver the experience. And delivering the experience is tricky. There is, of course, implementing everything. But creating the disclosures in a way that resonates with users is an art. It is a wordsmithing exercise. It's a combination of marketing and LCA and technology so that it is accurate. So, Windows Privacy Standard. When we were doing this work earlier, the people who had the knowledge had to sit around in the room, and 4 to 6 weeks later, after going through detailed reviews, they sort of imparted their opinions on people. And it's not the most efficient way to do it. So externalizing what the best practices are is really important. I had a whole loose leaf about this thick of privacy law and statutes and corporate best practices, but they didn't resonate with developers in any way. So we took this big stack of 500 pages and we distilled it to 5, which you now have. I think you all had a copy of it, right? I think that's correct. Yes, correct. And one of its big, claims to fame is that we're hoping it's going to make this development process more efficient, because if people at least are empowered with some basic ideas of how privacy works, if they have sort of the 10 commandments for what to do and what's okay, then we'll have less work to do at the back end. And if there are places where they decide not to follow the standard for some reason, then there's some exceptions process where they come and they vet it with the people that are knowledgeable, first with the privacy cabinet and then with their VPs and senior VPs if there's something that, so far it hasn't happened. But, we'd like it not to happen. But if it does happen, you never know. I mean, it's a judgment call, and you have to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. So how many people here actually read this? Well, I won't ask that question. That's not quite fair.
Like a professor.
Yeah, well, so just in a nutshell, we could have gone and defined any number of granularity in the data classes. We could have mixed it with interesting correlation issues. But when you're trying to deal with 15,000 people and you want to get this basic level of knowledge with all these different people with different experiences within computer science, we just came up with 3 simple data classes. And they are a simplification, but they are working so far. And we have sensitive data, which, of course, is intuitively things like stuff that could steal your identity. Another interesting one in sensitive data would be like your system vulnerabilities. We have technologies like security scanners that find what ports are open and what bad things you've left available to the hackers. And that data itself is quite sensitive and should be treated carefully. Next tier would be personal data. It's not quite as bad as the top stuff, which includes things that might discriminate against you, but somehow could track back to you and somehow be tied to you. And even serial numbers start falling into this category, as the case with HP and their printers in Europe. How many people know about that story? Yeah, so HP basically shipped out a bunch of printers that phoned home. They basically were telling HP about how much ink was left. And the users weren't, and it was sending back also the serial number of the equipment. And the EU felt that since HP also had registration cards on this equipment, they could tie the serial numbers to the individuals. And they weren't told of this, and therefore there wasn't sufficient disclosure. And they made them rev their software in the field. I thought it was interesting. And of course, non-personal data is great if we can have it, which is fully anonymous.
HP did it?
Huh?
Was HP doing that so they can call you up and tell you?
No, so here's the thing. With this decision, which was one of the data commissioners in Germany, one of the 15, HP told the commissioner that they do not link and had no technology in place to link. And the commissioner said, yeah, but you could in the future. The implication of that is huge, because if the EU at a broader level were to say, if you could conceivably do it, we're going to treat it as done, then there is no end, because conceivably you can do anything. No other commissioner has gone this far, no other privacy administrator, but I mean the implications are huge if it's broadly adopted.
Case in point, I just want to drive this point home, and we have this WindowsMedia.com site with its data collection, and we had MSN with the email address and the newsletter service, and we felt safe in doing the right thing because we had split those databases out. But relative to the EU, they just view Microsoft as one big entity. And they say, anytime you feel like correlating, you guys correlate. Because you could correlate, you've got this problem. And it's like, well, we can't help it. We're one big company. So we have a really big problem here because we have all these databases. And we can't just simply fall back in our privacy statement saying we're not going to correlate. It apparently isn't a sufficient enough thing to deal with. So I worry about stuff like that when these decisions at a high level get made that we're going to have to somehow honor. Did you have a quick comment?
Low-level question. So one of the nice things about the document was it does give a set of types for data values that, and these different classifications. So I wondered in common language runtime or the whole .NET infrastructure, whether you could provide some leadership by making those types explicit so that the third-party developers could...
So I'm going to turn the table over here to John who can talk about it.
So we're certainly looking at how to do this. And it's very nice in that it's very amenable to both program analysis and runtime checking, and this very clean hierarchy of types. The problem, as always, is strings, or in general uninterpreted data, that a lot of these things get treated as strings. And so the question is, can we drive these changes into the .NET framework class libraries? At what time can we do this? Because strings are not subclassable, etc. We're looking at least in terms of doing annotations on things, and it's a research technology at this point. We're working first internally, and then we'll work to productize it.
I mean, even if you had an explicit Social Security ID class, right? I mean, and if you're putting up a form and you have a pull-down box for a Social Security ID, that's going to help get the tag on there that you need to drive the analyses and runtime checks. And, so it seemed like, that was one of the great things about the document was that list of.
So, I have these dreams, and of course I wake up, but I have these dreams about what we could do in an architecture for privacy. And it combines many different aspects of ideas that have been discussed and put on the table, including uses of rights management to affect business rules on your data as it flows around the system. Also, this dynamic disclosure of being able to roll up what is actually in your system and what it's doing. And somehow you'd have to obviously describe your practices and then have that exported in some schema or XML and roll it up dynamically. And I would love to, at one point, get to that stage. In fact, I could draw out what this picture might look like. But for a company the size of Microsoft to turn on a dime to effect those changes is not practical. So they really have to be advanced development research kind of projects until there's enough momentum and clarity about how we're going to do this. The other big fear that I had was having automatic ways and programmatic ways of seeing what a privacy practice is, such as P3P, as an example. While as an idea has a nice property that you can write software to look at it and build agents and stuff like that, at the end of the day, it's the message you need to give to users about what's going on. And what I call the warm fuzzies or these intelligent summaries that are so hard to craft and to get right by persona. And that part's not being addressed. All I know is that we spend most of our time doing the crafting of the wordsmithing. And if that disappeared because of the infrastructure, I think we have a terrible loss because we spend a huge amount of energy trying to figure out how to message this to a user, and if it gets diced and sliced to the point where it's just little aspects that are being checked on, we failed. We have failed. We've built a very elegant system, but it's failed because you haven't built trust. And people don't understand the net effect of all those pieces together. I mean, we have, even on the books for Longhorn, a trust manager that has evaluators that look over software as they're being loaded to give you insight into what security issues they might have or even privacy issues. And my big concern with that technology is just simply that you don't want to mislead people into false sense of security. And at the same time, if you give them too much insight into all the little pieces that are wrong, they're lost.
Yeah,
so it's quite a challenge, but I would love to continue pursuing it. I think we should be pursuing it right now and investing in it, figuring it out, playing with it, getting it to a stage where it does meet those bars, where it does resonate with people.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the hardest issue. I think you could imagine some program or automatic technologies that would help in avoiding an inconsistency with a stated policy and the reality of the code.
So for example, the low-hanging fruit there is simply, data values and data stores. Yeah. And, if you have a data store that's accepting a sensitive data type, but it's not an encrypted store, or the data's not encrypted on the way in.
I want to echo Jeffrey's point, that although that's a really good place to start, that's far from the end user valuable solution. There's a host of other challenges in the user interaction with this that are new areas, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, again, we talked about correlation and commingling being sort of the big problems even after doing all this. And as those that have read the document, basically it's pretty simple. We have this privacy model where you start with the user system, you take some Windows feature being analyzed, you look at three big areas, its data collection, how it's being stored, and how you might share it. And of course, when you're sharing it, there's four different scenarios that we find interesting. There's locally sharing it on the machine to other Microsoft applications or components. There's sharing it to a third-party plugin. This is particularly challenging because you cross over a trust boundary. And it's very hard to make strong statements about what someone else is doing. And you need to somehow get this data to the user. Then, of course, going outside the box, both to Microsoft and to third parties, and the onward transfer that occurs. And anybody that's kind of savvy with how this stuff really works is that there are transforms that happen to the data inside these boxes, and that's the tricky part. So, for example, you might take data in and then aggregate it down so it transforms from a sensitive to a, non-personal type, and it's hard to reflect that, elegantly in a white paper. But it's really what does happen. So the standard covers all these things. We don't cover the third-party cases, obviously, because we can't talk about what they do. So examples of what the standard says, it says, these simple high-level statements like if you collect, store, or share sensitive data, you're going to provide a in-your-face prominent notice and obtain your consent before collecting or doing any of these things. You're going to have it disabled by default. We can debate whether or not those cases fall into the sensitive case and they should be off by default. And you've got to protect the data through either some kind of ACL or encryption. And some other high-level critical rules, which are just good rules of thumb, which people in privacy spaces live and breathe all the time.
You're going too fast.
Sorry.
So, thank you. Maybe I don't understand this, but on the face of it, it looks as though every time an application writes a file, it has to provide a notice that the application is sharing something with the file system. And every time that an attachment gets put on an email message, a notice has to pop up as well.
And depends on what's in it.
Well, it's a file you don't know, right? I mean, it's a...
Well,
that's your user ID.
That is one of the challenges. I mean, the question is, what do you do about raw data? Okay, we get it. We get it in core dumps. We get it, when we do error reporting.
Well, I type stuff into my editor, and the editor doesn't have any intelligence to know what it is, and then I click write, and
So it's kind of like let's see if I can pick a good one. It's a warning label situation that you would think is really dumb. Like, this coffee is really hot at McDonald's. Don't pour it on yourself, right? The warning label in the privacy statements, and I've actually done this a couple of times, where it says, note, the data you write here, other people may be able to see. So be careful when you share it, because they could see it. It's kind of like, well, it's obvious, but you can't pop up a message every time saying, please read your document really carefully to make sure that it has all the right, doesn't have anything sensitive you want other people to know about.
So saving Word would have a privacy notice every time you...
Yeah, that would be impractical.
So what do you actually mean? I mean, because this can only be a placeholder of what you actually mean.
Typically, what I mean is that when you know the semantics of the data you're collecting, these rules apply. Right? So very clearly, when you have a fill-in-the-blank field that says Social Security number and someone's typing something in, you could best be assured it is a Social Security number. And you need to handle it through this mechanism.
I see.
All right? So when you know the semantics, these rules apply. When you don't know the semantics, it becomes a judgment call. Because if there's a likelihood it is sensitive, right, then you need to address it. For example, if we do collect data during a core dump, a data dump during an error reporting session to Microsoft, we need in our privacy statement at a minimum to say, if there is anything sensitive in there, we're not going to look at it or use it against you, But we still have to turn it over to the court if they ask us for it, right? So, yes?
How many versions of save would you like to have? How many options? Maybe 5, 6, 10? One thing. Second thing is you have to be careful with some of these features may or may not be implementable with your current operation. So, for example, there was a feature, a requirement many years ago, so-called object reuse, which said that residual information left in objects had to be expunged in some way. Now, I bet you that even though your systems have satisfied C2 requirements in the Orange Book, which require to have object reuse, I bet you that for most objects that you have, you don't do that. right? You don't go over the disk, scrape the information when you delete it, or when you reallocate the storage, you don't scrape it in all cases.
Okay.
And
so
now, how far are you willing to go?
Well, let's start off with, coming up from the primordial slime, all right, which is no standard at all, and people just guessing what the rules are, to having something that they can refer to, get educated with, and then start using a common dialogue. Because I really was after nomenclature. I was really after, can we have a discussion in a very efficient manner about what's going on in your component, so we can make the judgment call if you can't figure it out based on the standard, or it doesn't make sense because the standard's not right. All right. So the standard is a great leveler of playing field here, in the sense that it educates people to a certain level, and now we can have a different kind of discussion. And I probably have had 20 to 30 of these meetings with people who said, I'm not sure I could follow the standard. So then we have this meeting, and then it's a whole different kind of meeting, because we're already now talking about the issue at hand of should they collect that data or not? Should the GUID be there? And that's the discussion you really want to have, which is that can you somehow demote the sensitivity of your data to something less sensitive because there's less burden on you as a person collecting it? And that's goodness. Oh, it's not yeah, it is. I mean, there's a minimization statement, inside the standard. But when
you're going through this,
I mean, if you actually use the least sensitive and smallest amount of user data to support the feature is a general concept. But the reality is people don't get this. It isn't until you kind of work with them a little bit and you get them to redesign their feature and say, did you know, why can't you just roll your GUID every session? Why do you need it to live that long? Can't you still get valuable data out of it? And that's, a session GUID is certainly a lot better than one that lives the life of the user. So, I mean, those are the kinds of conversations we have. And I'm ecstatic that we can have them, and they're actually coming proactively to us asking. This is a huge, huge change. This is the lifestyle change I'm talking about. And I wish people had this basic knowledge already coming in hired to the company. This is the knowledge I'm hoping academics could impart on people about these data practices and what the best practices are. Because I'm doing a lot of very basic, bread and butter training. And my hidden agenda for the standard is to generate discussion, right? To use common language, generate discussion. And I also expected to rev the standard once a month because I didn't think it would be right.
So in the reality check department, in academia, we seem to be having a lot of difficulty convincing students not to cheat on their exams.
No.
More so than maybe a decade ago. So I don't think this is a bit more subtle.
Oh, well, I guess I'm just,
It may well be that this is something that one doesn't do in college, and one does it starting from grade school when you start using a machine, and then the culture will change. But it's not.
I guess when people are
generation.
ripping their content and not caring about copyrights, I guess it is. I stand corrected because it's been a long time. Fred, you were actually my professor at Cornell. I don't know if you remember.
God, you're old.
That's all right.
But there was maybe a different set of ethics back then.
It is unfortunately quite different. I think we need to change the culture amongst computer users, but computer users start like in the third grade, and therefore basic hygiene is taught much younger, and that's really what you want to target.
But are you talking about computer users, or are you talking about design?
I actually was just simply asking that computer science, in the computer science curriculum, that there be some mention about privacy and about what that meant.
Oh, that is.
And to the extent that we actually can formalize any of the data classes or the way we do analysis, that could be very helpful. There's a threat modeling analysis for security, for example, that we're evolving. And to the extent that we educate people on how to find these kinds of things or avoid them. Anyway, it's just a side comment. So let's just go over some of these critical rules. The most important one in my mind is really the first one, which is having this clear business justification and value proposition. I cannot stress that earlier, say 2-3 years ago, I encountered a number of places where there was a business justification but no customer value proposition. Where it was like, well, why would the customer ever do that? And one of our hardest propositions right now today is product improvement. We call it SQUIM, software quality metrics. It's actually very good to have. You know, you can instrument your product and have it send back where people are hitting and what features they're using and stuff like that, so you get a really good sense of the usage. And you know, unfortunately, what's the value proposition to a user? Help Microsoft make better products so they can charge you more next time. You know, I'm sure I understand the proposition. It's a very
public good versus private good problem. That the value proposition is that would make better products so that other users can benefit. But doesn't that reflect the fact that the value proposition relates to whether the data is personalized or anonymous? What you're describing, it sounds like you don't have to know.
To be honest, people will give you their Social Security number for a T-shirt. Okay, so it really depends on what a value proposition is for people. And the fact is, they feel ripped off monetarily when you get to benefit from their data. And it's not so much this, you know, that my privacy was invaded. It was that I got ripped off. That's
even anonymous data?
Yeah, even anonymous data, because you helped contribute to the experience, and yet you got no benefit directly from it.
I don't know if it's currently true, you might know, but I mean, even in the context of healthcare research, people didn't want anonymous data used. I mean, it was really perverse.
I would have guessed that's because they didn't really trust anonymity.
I don't know.
As a side conversation, we should take it offline. But the main point here is that when people go design features, what I want them to do is to really put their shoes in a user's shoes, right? Their feet in a user's shoes, and say, why would I say yes to this? And if you can't figure out why to say yes to this, don't do it. You know, just right off the bat, don't even have the feature because you can't figure out how to message it.
Bless you. You know, you might consider when you're designing these, because if this European judge that Scott was talking about has his way, you might consider not even installing the components that are capable of collecting the private information, because if they're there, even though you say they're turned off, you could collect the information.
True. I mean, there's all these subtleties about this. A good example of how to handle this SQUIM issue might be, you know, allow us to track your behavior while using this program. You'll help us make better products, and we'll give you a discount on, you know, half off the future version of this product when it comes out. All right, so that at least the person understood they got a value. But the problem with that whole thing is that now you know who it is, and it's not anonymous anymore. So I'm not going to go down the path. The point is it's this duality between good reasons for business and good reasons for customers. And if you don't have both in the equation, just don't even bother coming to the table. Okay, you got to use the smallest amount. That's minimization. And quite frankly, we really haven't done a good job with privacy controls at the right granularity. And really kind of interesting is this whole dilemma of overrides. And we need to be able to allow administrators and enterprises to both set the default for a privacy setting and to lock it down. And this gets really tricky because, you know, there's a number of different places where this can happen. Sometimes you're on a domain and there's group policy as a mechanism. Other times you're in a small business and you don't have that kind of situation. Sometimes you're in a home and you've got a parent and child relationship where someone's trying to lock down their setting. So the paradigm needs to be there. We lack the infrastructure for doing it effectively. And then the big win here also is to consider things like regime-specific defaults. So we have issues in Germany, we have issues in China. You know, clearly what China might want may be different than New Jersey. And to come out with a SKU that all looks the same may not appease these regimes. And so having regime-specific defaults, and you can imagine an architecture for this where you've got these signed regime objects. You know, the problem is, do you have to like solder a GPS onto the motherboard in order to assert where you are to get the regime rules to be right? I mean, you've got issues like that to figure out.
Question, and this isn't meant to be a value judgment. It really is a question, but I'm just imagining, you know, must have clear business justification and customer value proposition to not do good security, or to, you know, to, like the parallel, right? Because I mean, you say must have clear justification, right, to collect data.
That's
right?
That's what we're talking about here. Right. It all starts with collecting data, you know, from the user. Do you have a good reason for collecting it, and are you going to be able to ensure its integrity through the system? But you're the first person in the chain, or maybe you're a middle person in the chain, and you need to make sure you preserve the safety of it as it moves through you.
So not always being kind of in opposition to protecting privacy. It's just a justification for collecting data, which may or may not have any implication for privacy depending on the context.
Well, I don't think you should collect data from people unless you have this really good reason for doing it, and it all stems at the very beginning of that.
No, but it might be to protect their privacy.
Oh, sure.
Well, I mean, I guess it also highlights that we think all compromises of security are bad, but not all compromises of privacy are bad. For example, when the government gets a search warrant to search my house, there's no question that it's a compromise of my privacy. And if the government gets a subpoena to order you to turn over documents about me, there's no question that's a compromise of privacy. But they may not be a bad thing.
And I push it back to a system design decision. And it's true that I think the approach would be anything that is undermining security or posing security risk is per se bad. And I think you're right, it's not always true in the privacy context. When you're talking about anything that undermines privacy, I would say is bad. But anything that requires a disclosure isn't necessarily bad. So
But even beyond that, there are some privacy compromising things that we think are necessary for purposes of law enforcement or purposes of maintaining business.
I agree. I'm just saying that you could create a parallel that would be different than what's just created.
Okay, so, yes, I love that.
But even beyond that point, we spent a better part of the day talking about security by design in some respects, and we know what that means, or if we don't know what that means, we have a lot of professors here to tell us what it means because they teach it and there's a recognized body of knowledge around it. I defy anyone to tell me what privacy by design means.
That's absolutely right.
Or what privacy means. Or to point me anywhere where I can learn what it means. I invite you guys to follow us. Otherwise, we're just all talking about our intuition.
No, I
don't think that's fair.
I do. I think it's absolutely fair. Privacy by design, as applied to products, point me to a single source that tells me what that is.
I mean, I think a good start is the notion of data minimization, unless there's customer value. And
sure, but that doesn't tell me how to make any, how to make any of these practical judgments.
But it does, because one thing, for example, I think Gene was saying is one thing that doesn't get onto the equation, and it's probably implicit, but just to make it clear, Gene says there is a, public good, or there's a public benefit if the government gets a search warrant and somebody's doing something bad and they go in. But what you wouldn't say here, we're going to collect this information because it would be a good thing, because then if this person was a bad person, right, and the government might need it. So that doesn't get to be part of the equation in terms of customer value or what the company gets from it. And so, I mean, I think at least as a core principle, this notion of data minimization.
Actually, I have to push back on that, though, because with some of the new regulations, for example, some of the telecom regulations in England, for example, there are explicit requirements for tracking and preserving.
So that's something different, because that's the government in its role protecting the public security coming in and saying, you, Microsoft, you have to do this.
We're outweighing the privacy decision.
And we're outweighing the privacy board and your own internal design thing, and then you have to say to the government, okay, we'll design that in. And so that's in the telecom world, that's the equivalent of CALIA, in which the digital networks get wiretappable. But I think the core kind of privacy principle is you don't create the personal data that can be tied to an individual unless there's a reason for doing it.
I think one of the dilemmas is, though, and not to oversimplify it, but security to a layperson can somewhat be defined as 1 or 0. It's either on or off. There's no such thing as half security that I'm going to accept. When you get into collecting of users' personal information, and I'm thinking about even from my experience as a Canadian interpreting the Canadian Privacy Act, and it says that that information should only be collected for the purposes for which it was intended, and it should be such that a reasonable person would consider it reasonable. And I think what the dilemma is that there's a whole range of options in terms of, first of all, reasonable person. Second of all, is the data appropriate for the purposes that it was collected? In other words, it might be very reasonable when evaluating a loan request to have for a car to have an understanding about how many miles you drive in a year.
That's where I think I might agree with Ira. I think applying those kinds of principles to product development is probably not very well articulated.
Exactly.
But I think something like the minimization principle, right, or is fairly well articulated. You can still argue, what's the minimum amount of information you need to deliver a service?
Well, but I think the two are connected, though.
Because absolutely they're connected. What's your definition of minimum? Let's just go the simple example.
And what's the service? So
Exactly.
I can create an email name and say, look, part of the conditions are I'm going to send you a marketing address. So I need your email address, right? So, and that's the minimum amount I need. So you give me your email address and I send everybody the same marketing thing. On the other hand, I can say, if you give me your email address and your age, now I won't send you mail if it's for geriatrics and you're under 65. So I've collected non-minimalist data in order to enhance somebody's privacy. Because I could have sent them stuff with less information.
But in the privacy analysis of that, I think it's something a little bit different, because you would say the person has given consent, explicit, specific consent. You've explained why you want the age, and there's a value proposition. I look at now things that are tailored to my age, and if I feel that I'm young at heart, presumably I can type in 16 instead of what my age is, and then I'll get things tailored to that age. If I think I'm a geriatric at heart, I can type in 89 years.
So it really comes down to notice and choice more than minimalist approach.
I think you design the underlying technology at that level, like the platform. I think data minimalization is very important. I think that as you go up and you're interacting with the consumer, I think notice and choice then takes on this other dimension, like the email hypothetical.
Here's where I think that actually it's hard to disentangle data minimalization from a question of reasonableness, which are often quite intractable. For example, what is the minimum amount of data that is necessary in order to process a loan request? I suppose some privacy advocates would say, well, the minimum amount of data should be your name, and that's it. The lender has no business asking for the amount of money you make, or your past bankruptcy history. We say, no, of course that's way less than the minimum because it's reasonable to demand this. On the other hand, the lender started, for example, asking, well, we'd like to know your political preferences because our suspicion is that liberals are more likely to default than conservatives or something like that. Then we might, whether it's a legal matter or not, we might say, well, that's not right because that's beyond the minimum necessary. What we really mean by minimum necessary is the minimum reasonable given our reasonable expectations for how this service should be reasonably provided. That's why I think that you don't have kind of really crisp rules of minimalization. They're tied into these contested questions of reasonableness.
I think if you go back to a developer and you say, right, okay, this is the service I want to provide, and as you said, you get into these conversations, well, do you really need a quit? Can you deal with a session ID? Right, there is a point, and they're like, oh, yeah, you know what, we don't need that. We can provide what it is we're trying to do with this. Right now, because I'm not suggesting that somebody else should come in and say, what's the minimum amount, but I think a question gets people to the point where you get better privacy by design.
Right. So, for example, we made the player ID anonymous by default, which was a huge change, but protected people's privacy to no end because it was a super cookie, right? We also took the media library and made it per user rather than global across the whole system to enhance privacy. And, I think we're saying sort of the same thing here, that I have this challenge, though. I need to describe how to do something in a way that will resonate with developers. Like, it's okay, not okay to do this. And so we have these high-level rules that kind of guide them at this time, although it doesn't quite fall naturally into privacy by default and stuff like that. It's not quite the model.
Back to the security discussion, we had this debate about the principle of least privilege and how hard it is, while this is a great principle, how hard it is to actually embody it in the code. It's the same thing with the principle of data minimization. So this is not in general as well understood. It's got more fuzzy things around the edge, and the experience with people embodying it in the code is far more primitive in general.
Okay. So I'm going to take the meeting back over. There's, from what I know, 15 minutes left. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. There's actually information I need from you. And so I want to make sure I get to pose a couple of questions. So Huh? Yeah. Well, you get to eat dinner, right? Exactly. So I want to wrap up the presentation by just mentioning what we're doing in Longhorn. And I already mentioned that we've got this lifestyle change ongoing. We're doing all this training of all our developers. That's all a good thing, I think. We're trying to drive through all this detailed privacy analysis. And quite frankly, it would be really nice if there were better tools for doing this. So we have a couple of first attempts at these tools, but it would be fantastic if the industry actually had a better way of doing this in general. And then for the first time, Microsoft was going to provide this privacy statement that's comprehensive across all of Windows. If you go there today, there's like 10 different privacy statements or more. I think it's 30 at this point. And we really don't have a unified one just for the platform itself. So this will be a big improvement. We, of course, are going to be establishing guidelines so that things are much more consistent and convenient for users. And then there's this concept of a trust center, which is a destination which offers education, status, and control over things like security, privacy, and reliability. And then we made a couple of P3P improvements, which includes easier discovery of the fact that a site might have a P3P statement. I know that the government has made it an edict that their sites actually have them, so it would be nice if they could see them, and provide a little better summary when you try to actually view what the statement looks like. So this leads me to my first question about P3P investments. I really need to get some sense from this audience about how you feel about P3P and whether or not it's the right approach for getting privacy disclosure to happen.
Did you hear we had a discussion of this 6 months ago?
Did you really?
Yeah.
That was different. That was with Richard, though, and
yeah.
Richard's off climbing mountains now.
I realized that, but...
So in a nutshell, can someone just tell me whether you think it's worth it to keep investing in P3P?
Before the privacy experts reply, I think the privacy experts thought so, and no one else was enthusiastic, but I'm being very opinionated about that.
Yeah, my biggest concern is the ecosystem doesn't quite exist yet for widespread adoption.
Yeah.
And it's not clear whether, from a technology perspective, everything that needs to be disclosed is in that schema. And of course, there is work on P3P 2.0 and stuff like that. But is this a place where we should be really investing?
So what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is to try to figure out a new unified schema that actually does maybe some of the things that P3P doesn't, and apply it not only to services but to applications. And actually make that a holistic experience as part of installing new software. Inside the manifest of the software is this schema that you can then look at and figure out. And maybe we can even address some of these issues of intelligent summaries being bubbled up through the interface so you can actually see what this software is thinking it's doing.
Yeah, I think it's extremely valuable. I think it's going to be hard. A lot of people are very much concerned about spyware.
Yes.
And if you are able to guarantee in some ways that your application or your software doesn't contain spyware, I think that it will actually drive the point for other software producers, and we'll get a lot less of that because of the market pressures.
Okay, so that leads me to my next point about objective and subjective trust, where I really would like in the last 10 minutes to talk about this. As I mentioned, we have this trust manager which kind of wakes up when software is going to be launched or loaded on your system. And there's an architectural opportunity to put in evaluators to look at that software and verify. It could be like antivirus checkers and any number of things. Or the software can run in this sort of managed space where it has to ask for certain resources to use. And if it's asking for more than you want to give, then you already know it's asking for all these privileges to go and like reformat your drive and blah, 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 right? So you can know something about what it needs to do. And it won't get those rights unless it asks for them. So in an objective sense, if you declare these practices, then at least you know what this thing could do or would do. My problem is I don't have a privacy schema today that I can attach to applications that we're ready to enforce that everybody do, partially because you can't cover all the scenarios and you're really not disclosing the actual behavior at a level where it can resonate with the user. So I'm stuck. I don't really have, from a privacy perspective, an objective way to measure what's going to happen with this piece of code. The thought I was thinking was that in the interim, maybe we can actually tap community to drive trust. And I say that because it's pretty clear if you poll people, there's a large number of people that just don't trust Microsoft, either because we were too big or successful or they think we do evil things. So who do they trust? And if they were to ask them a question, what would they ask? So there you are about to load a piece of software, and you're not sure what it is. Maybe it's an ActiveX control, and you wish you could call a friend and say, hey, is this thing safe? Is this thing spyware? Will this thing spam me? What's the questions that a regular person would ask a knowledgeable person about a piece of software they're about to install? And what would their answers be like? And if they had these answers, could they then make a trust decision based on their confidence of the person they talk to and their community, et cetera?
That's called subjective trust?
That's what I call subjective trust, right, because it's an opinion.
So,
all right, so the proposal that I had was, as part of this trust manager experience when things pop up, we also offer potentially a trust scorecard. And the trust scorecard would basically have some number of trusted critics you subscribe to. And these trusted critics could be anybody. It's anybody that you actually trust. Maybe it's Slashdot because you just hate Microsoft and you trust them. Or maybe it's Better Business Bureau. Or maybe it's PC Magazine. Maybe it's Dell. Maybe it's your friend or who's really knowledgeable and they've subscribed out. And they get pinged with the unique ID of the software that's being loaded. And they provide their opinions. And their opinions fall within very narrow categories that we define, such as, will it spam you? Is it spyware? Is it stable? Is it safe? You can imagine cute icons across the top. And you can imagine rows of trusted critics that you subscribe to. And just like a movie listing for movie ratings, you look at a movie you want to go to, and you look across and you see 3 critics, and they give a bunch of stars, and the last person gave a bunch of bombs. And if you go to the movie, and it stinks, you say, these other people don't know what they're talking about. I like what this person says. And if they do this 2 or 3 times, you build up this is someone that resonates with you in your value system. And therefore, you want to subscribe to their opinions about the software. And so this would be, at the blog level or whatever, you create sort of this community where this information can flow back into places where people need to make decisions about software that they might either buy or download. And these little scorecards pop up, and you give people, be there in a second, give them some real estate about, maybe their headshot or their logo of their community, so they get some promotion and they, become the new rock star of critics. And just to finish out, one example I have is I went to download.com recently, and there was this piece of software that had 4 stars on it, saying, please, this is great for downloading. And you read the email thread, and it said, don't load this, it's spyware, it's terrible, don't do it. And so there was a big disconnect between the rating that was given by this entity and what people actually thought about it. And so I was thinking, isn't there some way we could tap the gazillion millions of people that don't have lives who might actually make opinions about this stuff and actually might be right?
You mean like eBay users?
Well, whatever. It's the same. It's actually the same thing about critics. The ratings for the sellers. The first thing you check.
I have nothing but heard nothing but I don't shop on eBay, but my wife does, and she seems to think they're always right. Every time a seller is rated high, they perform well, and every time a seller is rated low, they perform poorly, and she's avoided those.
Well, there you have it. So this is the model I'm suggesting. Do you think there's value in having the subjective level of trust be available to people?
But that's a closed community, eBay is, and they're very militaristic about people who disobey their rules.
Well, I'm hoping the community at large is self-monitoring.
Yeah.
So another...
He said his books.
I think there are 2 models. I think the good point about subjective trust is it mirrors how people in a wide variety executive contexts make their decisions. So as a principle it is sound because that's what I think generally people have come to in making decisions when there is no objective standard. I think that at times you've talked about sort of the consumer reports model where you point to an existing trustworthy entity,
just some people,
trademark and a brand. Exactly, but one that has proven itself.
I don't trust PC Magazine because I think they take ads on the people they're rating.
They also have a big bank account in case of libel lawsuits, which turn out to be relevant here. The other possibility is communities where there are problems both of legal liability, but also the possibility that people can easily infiltrate there and lie for whatever reasons. I, for example, don't really trust Amazon reader reviews, among other things, because my brother posted a favorable review of my mother's cookbook. Any son should do that for his mother, but it shows that it's not fully reliable. But there's actually a serious legal liability issue, in fact, if you do go to the non-well-identified sources.
So I was going to, you're asking a question about objective versus subjective, but I want to point out something else. If you created an infrastructure and you started people thinking about using others' opinions as a way of inferring what we like to know as objective properties, well, for a long time in the security space, I have been worrying about how do you figure out what policy you should run a program under. You obviously can't trust the provider of the program to give you the policy. If you had a way of doing fine-grained, I guess it's now called behavior blocking, I'd call it a reference monitor. So where do you get that policy from? And you can't get it from the provider of the software because if they put the Trojan horse in, they also put the thing in. So you could imagine people starting companies. Policies are us. And what they do is they sell policies, and if they become trusted, then you buy policies for them. So the whole notion of going to sources that you want to make your own evaluation decision on to solve your privacy and security problem is something that could be quite general. It needn't be restricted to this one problem.
Another model would be an underwriter lab.
But you could subscribe to that and to the guy at the street, in terms of the next set of opinions.
Okay. Two things about subjective trust. If you go to this, you automatically expect that the user will have a trust metric, a procedure by which they'll evaluate different recommendations. And some of those might have to be automated. Second thing, if you go to that, think in terms of a non-wired internet, a wireless internet, where in fact you may have to operate without the source of information that does the subjective trust. So then you have to generate recommendations online in the wireless area because you may not have access, you may be out of range.
So you may not have access to your trusted friends.
The question is, what are your defaults for the subjective trust?
So just realize that this is just one added piece of information that could be part of a person's trust decision. And so the question is it kind of interesting or intriguing enough as a community thing or as a way to stimulate a business ecosystem? And I'm not saying this is easy to set up because we can't do it and influence the results in any way. It will immediately be discredited.
You have to put in place the infrastructure.
Correct.
And look, PGP did it. But this is how PGP keys are accepted. And they don't have a say in whether you trust a key. They just put in place a way for you to make those assessments and evaluate.
One more last comment. You also have to realize that you operate in an uncertain world. So your trust metrics or your way of mentally evaluating things would return not 0 or 1, it would return 0.7.
So you can imagine the table of results have thumbs up, thumbs down, or some level of points. But I want to thank you very much for your feedback on everything, on the standard, on our initiative, on some of the earlier opt-in dialogues. I will be attending for dinner, so if any of you really feel compelled to tell me more,
I have one last
just
thing
make sure
to
I
add.
have a drink in my hand when that happens,
I have one
and
last
I'll
thing to
listen.
add. Can you back up 2 slides?
Sure.
One more. The answer to that is yes, because you're thinking about this, and I'm not sure many companies are, and you're obviously engaging very smart people. I'm not included in that. I don't have any ideas here about these things. So the answer to that is yes.
Do you work for Microsoft?
No.
Sure.
Just checking.
Oh, yes, I do.
They get money from Microsoft?
On the payroll. Well, thank you very much.
He gets 1%.